6:58 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. The house was already awake before I was. "Mom, we've talked about this. You can't stay here anymore." The words came from the doorway, flat and rehearsed, as if they had been practiced somewhere I wasn't invited. I sat up slowly. Thin morning light slipped through the lace curtains and rested at the foot of the bed my husband and I had shared for 43 years. The ceiling fan turned once, then twice, pushing cool air across my face. I must have misheard, I thought, but the silence that followed confirmed I hadn't. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. He stood where he was, arms folded, already braced for resistance he didn't believe would come. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stood, the familiar sound grounding me. My robe felt heavier than usual, or maybe it was the moment. "You can't stay?" I repeated, not to challenge him, but to understand the shape of the sentence. "It's just not practical," he said, glancing past me into the room. "Things need to change." Change. Such a gentle word for eviction. I looked around. The dresser with its worn brass handles, the framed photograph tilted slightly crooked, the faint smell of lemon polish lingering from yesterday. Since when did this become temporary? My chest tightened, but my voice didn't. "Since when?" I asked. Daniel exhaled, the sound edged with impatience. "We'll explain later. For now, just get ready." Later, I thought. Later is where people put things they don't want questioned. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in restraint. I had learned long ago that calm unsettles people more than anger ever could. As he turned away, I noticed something settle inside me, not fear, not grief, but certainty. This conversation had been decided before it ever reached me, and that meant I needed to listen very carefully to what came next. 7:14 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. Morning settled into the rooms like nothing was wrong. The kettle clicked off in the kitchen, a sound so familiar it almost convinced me this was an ordinary day. I wrapped my hands around a chipped ceramic mug, blue flowers faded from years of use, and stood by the window. Outside, the oak tree stirred gently, Spanish moss swaying as it always had. The world was steady, only my place in it felt suddenly uncertain. Daniel moved through the house with purpose. Drawers opened, cabinets closed. He avoided looking at me as if eye contact might slow him down. He's already living in the next hour, I realized. I'm still standing in this one. I felt strangely calm, not numb, aware. Calm in the way you become when something important clicks into focus. Fear hovered at the edges, but it didn't take hold. What I felt more strongly was disbelief, quiet, persistent. This house had absorbed decades of our lives. Birthdays marked on the doorframe. Grief held in these walls after my husband passed. Mornings just like this one, where nothing needed explaining. "You don't have to rush," I said evenly. Daniel paused, then shook his head. It's better if we do. Better. Another word meant to smooth sharp edges. I noticed details I'd never thought to question before. A folder on the counter that wasn't mine, my mail stacked too neatly, my keys no longer hanging on their hook. Pay attention, I told myself. This matters. I took a breath and straightened my shoulders. Whatever he believed about me, my age, my willingness, my silence, was shaping his confidence. And confidence, I knew, often grows best where it hasn't been challenged. As Daniel reached for his phone and stepped outside, I stayed where I was, listening to the house breathe. This was still my ground, and I intended to understand exactly why someone thought otherwise. 7:46 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. Memory carries weight when the present begins to tilt. When my husband passed 23 years ago, the house didn't become quiet in a peaceful way. It became practical. Bills still arrived on time. The roof still leaked during heavy rain. The sugar maple in the yard still dropped leaves that needed raking. Grief didn't pause responsibility. It sharpened it. I learned how to read documents slowly, line by line, at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. I learned which questions mattered and which answers were meant to distract. I signed my name only when I understood every word beneath it. Loss teaches you caution. Survival teaches you precision. Daniel was younger then, eager, confident, always in a hurry to move forward. He believed progress meant speed. I believed it meant stability. We didn't argue loudly. We rarely argued at all. He would smile, nod, and wait for me to finish speaking, already certain his way would come eventually. I mistook that patience for respect. The house stayed mine in every sense that mattered. I paid for its upkeep. I chose when things were repaired and when they waited. I kept folders neatly labeled insurance, taxes, deeds, because order kept anxiety quiet. Not because I distrusted my family, but because I respected the life my husband and I had built together. Over time, Daniel began offering help more often. "Let me handle that," he'd say. "You've done enough." I accepted occasionally, not from weakness, but from fatigue. Peace has a way of softening your guard when you're not watching. Sitting there that morning, hearing I no longer belonged in my own home, something settled clearly inside me. This hadn't started today. It had been forming for years. 8:12 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. Familiar faces can still cast new shadows. Daniel didn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. That would have been easier to recognize. He arrived with concern, with timing that felt thoughtful, with a tone that suggested he was stepping in, not over. He began stopping by more often, always unannounced, always smiling. He'd glance around the house the way people do when they're assessing something quietly. Not judging, I told myself, just noticing. He commented on small things. The front steps could use repair. The spare room wasn't being used. The house felt too big for one person. "Have you thought about downsizing?" he asked once, casually, as if the idea had simply drifted into his mind. I noticed how often he used the word we. We should think ahead. We don't want surprises. We need to make sure everything's handled. The phrasing was gentle, inclusive, but it blurred lines I had always kept clear. Paperwork followed, nothing alarming at first, just documents to look over, forms he said were standard. He never rushed me, which made it easier to miss how often he brought them back already marked with sticky notes. Just sign where highlighted, he'd say, setting a pen beside my plate. I didn't sign then. I said I'd review them later. He smiled. He didn't argue. But the papers returned again the following week, and the next. I began to notice other things. Conversations he ended for me when the phone rang, appointments he offered to coordinate, mail he sorted before I saw it. Always helpful, always calm. What unsettled me wasn't his actions, it was his certainty. Certainty that I wouldn't object, certainty that I wouldn't question, certainty that the house, my life, my decisions were already drifting into his hands. And beneath his concern, I felt it clearly for the first time. This wasn't protection. It was positioning. 9:03 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. The first betrayal arrived disguised as efficiency. I found the envelope by accident. It sat on the corner of the dining table, half covered by yesterday's mail, its edges crisp, unfamiliar. The return address belonged to a law office I hadn't contacted in years. I opened it slowly. The paper felt heavier than it should have been, as if it carried more than ink. The language was polite, professional, calm. Words like authorization, temporary authority, administrative convenience. I read each line carefully, the way I always had. Then I reached the page that made my breath pause. My name was there, typed, clean, official. That isn't how I sign, I thought. Not with panic, but with certainty. My signature has always leaned slightly forward. The last letter, looping, the way my husband used to tease me about. This version was stiff, correct in form, wrong in truth. Daniel appeared behind me before I heard his footsteps. "Oh," he said lightly, as if I'd uncovered nothing more than a misplaced receipt. "You saw that." "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "It's just something to help manage things," he replied, "in case you ever needed support." He smiled, reassuring, practiced. "It doesn't change anything." "You filed documents in my name," I said. He didn't deny it. That was the part that settled deepest. "I assumed you'd be fine with it," he said. "It's for your own good." For your own good. The phrase landed exactly where betrayal always does, quietly, and without room to argue. I folded the papers and set them back on the table. "We'll discuss this later," I said. Relief crossed his face. He thought the matter closed. But inside me, something aligned with precision. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't help. This was the first time he acted without asking and expected me not to notice. 10:41 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. The second betrayal unfolded through routine. It didn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, wrapped in schedules and decisions that no longer asked for my input. Daniel began showing up with plans already made, appointments I didn't remember scheduling, conversations that had apparently happened without me present. "I took care of it," he'd say, setting his phone on the counter. "You don't need to worry about these things anymore." Anymore. Mail stopped coming directly to me. It appeared already opened, sorted, summarized aloud instead of handed over. When I asked to see the originals, Daniel's smile tightened, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. "Mom, you trust me, right?" he said once, as if trust were a switch he could flip whenever clarity threatened him. I began asking small questions. Who requested the change? Who authorized the update? His answers slid around specifics, smooth, confident, unbothered. They suggested it. It's standard. This is how it's done now. Now had become his favorite word. One afternoon, I stopped by the bank myself. The lobby smelled faintly of cleaner and old carpet, familiar in a way that steadied me. I asked the clerk a simple question about my account access. She looked at her screen, then back at me. "Your son is listed as primary," she said. "All decisions route through him." Primary. I thanked her and left without comment. Outside, the Louisiana heat pressed down gently. Cicadas loud, unconcerned. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the meaning settle. This wasn't about helping me rest. It wasn't about protection. It was about replacement. By the time I returned home, Daniel was watching me too closely. "You seem tired," he said. "You should lie down." Rest in his voice sounded less like care and more like instruction. That night, the house felt different. Every sound carried intent. The first betrayal had been paperwork. This one was erasure. And I understood then. He wasn't waiting for permission anymore. 6:12 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. The breaking point arrived without warning. I woke to unfamiliar voices moving through the house, low, efficient, paired with Daniel's calm tone. The door to my bedroom opened before I could sit up. Two men stood behind him, polite faces, firm posture. One held a clipboard. The other avoided my eyes. "Mom," Daniel said evenly, "we need to move you for a bit." Move me, I thought, from my own room. I asked where. No one answered directly. Words like temporary and for your safety floated past me, light, empty, already decided. When I tried to stand on my own, a hand touched my elbow, guiding, not forceful, but uninvited. That was worse than force. The humiliation settled quietly, the way shame often does when it isn't loud enough to fight back. "This isn't necessary," I said. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. Daniel sighed, rehearsed. "You're confused," he replied. "This will make things easier." Easier for whom? They walked me down the hallway as if escorting a decision already made. The house smelled different, cleaner, stripped. My door frame brushed my shoulder as I passed, a small, grounding pain. I noticed photographs missing, drawers half open, the bed turned down like a guest space. Not mine. I stopped. I didn't agree to this. Daniel didn't turn around. "You don't need to," he said. That sentence did it. Something cold and clear settled inside me. Not panic, not anger. Clarity. I understood then that silence would no longer protect me. It was being used against me. At the front door, morning light spilled across the floor. I asked one final question: on whose authority? No one answered. The door opened. And standing there, barefoot on my own threshold, I made a quiet promise to myself. If he wanted authority, he would have to prove it. And I would no longer make it easy. Long pause once. 7:03 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. Aftermath settles. Determination takes shape. They placed me in the back seat of a car that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old vinyl. No one spoke. The engine idled with a patient hum, as if it knew how long this moment might take. I folded my hands in my lap and focused on breathing evenly. Observe, I told myself. Remember. The town passed by in pieces oak trees draped with moss, a gas station lifting its shutters, the church where my husband and I had sat every Sunday for 40 years. Everything looked the same. That was the unsettling part. My life had shifted, but the world hadn't noticed. We stopped in front of a quiet building I didn't recognize. Beige walls, clean lines, temporary. Inside, the air felt too cool. A woman explained routines I hadn't asked for: evaluation, safety, words designed to dull edges. Someone handed me a paper cup of water and pointed to a chair. When I was finally alone, the silence changed. It wasn't empty. It was useful. I checked myself for panic and found none. What I felt instead was resolve steady, unmistakable. My purse was gone. My phone, too, but my memory was clear. My thoughts intact. And tucked inside the lining of my coat, missed in their haste, was a folded envelope I had carried for years, my husband's handwriting on the front. Familiar, anchoring. I sat with that envelope in my hands and let the truth settle. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't weakness. This was containment, and I understood then. This moment wasn't the end of my control. It was the pause before I took it back. 10:18 a.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. Preparation begins quietly. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I hadn't opened it in years. not because I'd forgotten it, but because I trusted the time hadn't been right. My husband had always believed in timing. Truth lands better when people are done talking, he used to say. I sat alone in that small room, listening to the soft tick of the wall clock, and slid my thumb beneath the seal. The paper inside was crisp, carefully folded, his handwriting neat and unmistakable. My breathing slowed as I read, not rushed, not emotional, just attentive. This wasn't a surprise, it was confirmation. The will was clear, precise, updated only a year before he passed, properly notarized, deliberately stored outside the house Daniel now treated as his. Every provision had been reviewed line by line with an attorney. Ownership, residency, authority. My name appeared again and again, not as a courtesy, but as fact. I closed my eyes briefly and let the room settle. So this is what he prepared, I thought. Not drama, not confrontation, protection. Footsteps passed outside the door. A voice murmured. Routine continued. They believed this pause meant control. They didn't know it was preparation. I reread one paragraph carefully, the clause about residence. My right to remain. Unconditional. Lifelong. No ambiguity. No kindness hiding conditions. I folded the papers back into the envelope and held it against my palm. It felt warm now. Certain. That was when I understood what came next. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't explain. I would let the document speak exactly as it was written. Some battles are won by raising your voice. This one would be won by opening the right envelope at the right time. And Daniel had no idea it existed. 1:03 p.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. The turning point waits. Daniel didn't knock this time. He never did when he believed something was already decided. He stepped into the room with the casual authority he'd been practicing for months, keys jingling softly in his hand like punctuation at the end of a sentence. We need to talk about timelines, he said, glancing at his phone. I've arranged something temporary, just until we finalize things. Temporary, I noted, the word people use when they want compliance without discussion. I remained seated, my hands folded over the envelope resting in my lap. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the kind he preferred. Sharp, efficient, impersonal. Sunlight cut across the floor in a clean line, stopping just short of my shoes. Finalize what? I asked. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He sighed, rehearsed patience slipping into his tone. The house, Mom. You know this can't stay the way it is. It's not practical. Practical. Another word that sounds reasonable until you ask who it serves. He kept talking. Storage options, schedules, paperwork already in motion. I listened without interrupting. Let him finish, I told myself. People reveal more when they think they're uninterrupted. When he finally paused, I reached for the envelope. Daniel noticed immediately. His eyes followed the movement, curiosity sharpening into concern. What's that? He asked. I didn't answer right away. I placed the envelope on the table between us, aligning it carefully with the edge. Small gestures matter when you want a room to feel ordered. It's something your father prepared, I said evenly. Something you should read before you plan anything else. He laughed once short, dismissive. "Mom, we've been over all that." "No," I replied. "You've been over what you assumed." I watched his smile hesitate just long enough to matter as his fingers closed around the envelope. The pause that followed wasn't loud, but it was decisive. 1:27 p.m., St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. The will speaks. Daniel didn't sit down. He stood at the table, turning the envelope over once, then twice, as if weight alone could tell him what was inside. The room was quiet enough to hear the ceiling fan click as it shifted speeds. "This is old," he said. "Dad handled things years ago." So did I thought, but I let the silence answer for me. He tore the envelope open with more force than necessary. The papers slid out creased from being folded, not from being ignored. At first his eyes moved quickly, scanning, searching for what he expected to find. Then they slowed. The color drained from his face in small, precise stages. I watched his jaw tighten as names, dates, and clauses arranged themselves into something undeniable. A will, properly filed, properly witnessed, updated after my husband's illness, after the year Daniel claimed nothing had changed. "What is this?" he asked, though the question had already answered itself. "It's your father's," I said, "and it's valid." He flipped pages faster now, his breath shortening. "This doesn't make sense. The house was left to me," I finished calmly. "In full, with protections." His finger stopped halfway down the page. I recognized the paragraph immediately, the one we discussed late one night at the kitchen table, when my husband's voice was weak, but his mind was clear. "No transfer without written consent," Daniel read aloud. "No relocation under family direction alone." The room felt different now, smaller, focused. "You knew about this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And now, so do you." The fan clicked again. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the road. Daniel lowered the pages slowly, as if gravity itself had increased. And for the first time since he'd started planning my removal, he had nothing left to assume. 3:09 p.m., St. Martin Parish Courthouse. Truth enters the room. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax, the kind of place where voices instinctively lower themselves. Daniel walked a step ahead of me, his shoulders stiff, his confidence reduced to momentum. People we knew were already there, a cousin, a neighbor, a family friend who had just wanted to understand what was going on. I took my seat without hesitation. The clerk called the matter plainly. No drama, just names and dates. The judge listened with hands folded, eyes steady. Daniel's attorney spoke first careful words, softened edges, suggestions of misunderstanding and family concern. He talked around the facts, hoping they might lose their shape. Then the will was entered into record. Page by page it was read aloud. Each clause landed cleanly, audible to everyone in the room. Ownership, residency, restrictions, protections. The language was exact, the way my husband had insisted it be. "Clear enough to outlast noise," he used to say. Daniel shifted in his chair. I did not look at him. When it was my turn, I stood, my voice carried without effort. I was not confused, I said. I was not consulted, and I did not consent. I paused, letting the words settle where they needed to. This document reflects my husband's wishes and my rights. The judge nodded once. The will is valid, he said, and binding. A murmur moved through the benches. Someone inhaled sharply. Someone else looked down. Daniel's attorney said nothing more. The judge concluded with instructions firm, procedural, final. Any attempt to remove me from my home without lawful authority was prohibited. Any assumption otherwise was corrected. As we stood to leave, eyes followed me, not with pity, but recognition. I walked out slowly, my steps measured. The truth hadn't raised its voice. It hadn't needed to. 5:41 p.m. St. Martin Parish. Consequences take their shape. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It came in small, undeniable adjustments, the kind that don't argue, don't explain, and don't reverse themselves. Daniel's calls stopped coming, not because I blocked him, but because there was nothing left to demand. By evening, notices had been sent. The attorney explained it plainly. Access revoked, authority clarified, boundaries restored. Where Daniel's name had once appeared, beside decisions that weren't his to make, it no longer did. The system had rebalanced itself. At a family gathering days later, the room behaved differently. Conversations paused when I entered, then resumed with care. Someone offered me a chair, my chair without asking who preferred it otherwise. Daniel arrived late and stayed near the door. Polite, reduced. He nodded once in my direction, the way people do when familiarity has lost its power. No apology came. None was needed. What surprised me wasn't his silence. It was how quickly others adjusted. When authority disappears, people recalibrate. Assumptions loosen. Stories shorten. Control does not survive scrutiny for long. That night I returned to the house alone. I turned the key myself. The familiar click felt heavier than sound. Inside, everything waited exactly as I'd left it. The photographs, the worn arm of the sofa, the window catching the last of the daylight. I placed the courthouse copy of the will back into its envelope and set it in the drawer. Not hidden, not displayed, simply returned to its place. This wasn't triumph, it was correction. And correction, I learned, carries its own quiet finality. Some downfalls are loud and public. Others happen when the room stops deferring and never starts again. 6:22 a.m., St. Martin Parish. Healing settles where fear once lived. The morning came gently, without the sharp edge I'd grown used to. Light slipped through the curtains and rested on the floor in soft rectangles, as if the house itself were breathing easier. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee warming my hands, listening to familiar sounds, the refrigerator humming, a bird calling from the oak tree outside. Nothing felt hurried, nothing felt guarded. For weeks my body had been braced without my asking, shoulders tight, jaw set. Even sleep had felt like a task. That morning something loosened, not suddenly, naturally, as if my body had finally received permission to stand down. I thought of my husband, not with the ache that used to follow his name, but with steadiness. He had built this life carefully, not loudly, not for applause. He believed in preparation, in clarity, in leaving things properly aligned. Sitting there, I understood something clearly. His will wasn't just protection, it was trust. Trust that I would recognize my own worth when it mattered. I moved through the house slowly, touching familiar things, the back of a chair, the edge of the counter. Each object felt like a quiet witness, unchanged, patient. I hadn't lost my place here. I'd simply been reminded of it. Later, I opened my notebook and added one final line. Not evidence, not instruction, just a truth written plainly. I am still here. I always was. Healing didn't arrive as relief or celebration. It arrived as balance, as belonging restored without announcement. I closed the notebook and set it aside. The work was done. What remained was living without explanation, without permission, and without fear. 7:04 a.m., St. Martin Parish. What remains after justice is quiet. Morning settled into the house the way it always had, without asking, without forcing itself to be noticed. I stood by the front window and watched the fog lift from the yard, the grass dark with dew, the fence line steady and familiar. There was no ceremony to mark the end of what had happened. Life rarely offers that. It simply continues, waiting to see how you will meet it. For a long time, I believed dignity meant endurance, that keeping peace required shrinking, that love asked you to give ground quietly. I know better now. Dignity is not something you surrender to be kind. It is something you carry, so others know where to stand. They had mistaken my calm for permission, my patience for absence, my silence for agreement. But silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is control withheld until the moment arrives. And when it does, it speaks clearly. I folded my husband's will and returned it to its place, not as a shield anymore, but as a marker of what had already been set right. He had trusted the truth to hold. He had trusted me to recognize it. That trust had been enough. I stepped outside and felt the cool air on my face. The house behind me stood firm, not because it belonged to me on paper, but because it had always been mine in practice. Built, kept, understood. If there is a lesson here, it is not about winning. It is about refusing to disappear. Age does not make you invisible. Calm does not invite erasure. And a life lived carefully leaves records that speak when you no longer need to. I walked forward into the day, carrying nothing extra. That was my justice, and that was enough.